how did Korea get to be such a prosperous and dynamic country, which is what it is today? Hello, everyone. This is Mark Peterson. Today, I am at the Korea Society, and we are going to cut several short videos introducing important topics that we hope classroom teachers can use in their classroom instruction. And we're looking today here at the Korea Society at questions about history. And I have with me one of the officers here. You specialize in culture and arts. This is Rachel. And Rachel, welcome to the program. Let's talk about history. I gave a lecture last night. We talked about history. Do you have some questions to start us off?
I guess my question is about your work, and I just wanted to ask how your work and your study aims to really redefine the common misconceptions in Korean history, and what motivated you to start this research.
I've been doing research on Korea and Korean history for 58 years. How old are you?
I'm 23.
So more than twice your age, I've been working on this. You know, the Buddhists were right. Lifetime is like a second. These things are all relative, and I can't believe it's been that long. But I'm concerned about introducing something to the classroom that is contradictory to what the textbooks teach. And yet, you have to teach the truth, and history is changing. History, for most people, is misunderstood. They think history is a thing out there they go and look at. But in reality, history is something that changes and needs reinterpretation, because history tells us who we are now and how we got here. And Korea in the 1960s, when I first went to Korea, was a very, very poor place. It was one of the poorest countries in the world. They'd suffered the Japanese occupation. They'd suffered the Korean War. People were desperately poor. Per capita income was $125 per year. That is really, really poor. And if you're in that kind of society, what kind of outlook do you have on the world? You know? And so Korean history at that time sort of told the story of how we got to be so poor and how we got to be so beaten up and how we were an unfortunate and victimized people. That was the history I first learned in Korea. History today has to be different, because if it answers the question, how did Korea get to be such a prosperous and dynamic country, which is what it is today? How'd that happen? Well, that's a different set of circumstances than being beaten up. And so what I've come up with is the 20th century was awful for Korea. There's no question about that. But as you look back beyond the 20th century, there were a lot of really happy parts of Korean history. For example, the longest dynasties of any country in the world. Long dynasties says peace and says stability. And that's quite different from the history that I first started to learn. So as a classroom student looks at these different approaches to Korean history, I think it's not just me, but a lot of young historians are starting to look at history in a different way. A lot of young historians who are younger than I am. It's a fad among younger. It's a trend among younger historians to re-examine the basic questions. So for a classroom student at a junior high or a high school or even a college, this is a good question. You know, what is history, and how does history play out in Korea? And is it valid to say history of the 1960s is very different from the history of 2023, because the forces that acted on the country to make it what it is were very, very different. So that's how I look at Korean history, as sort of different over time. History doesn't stay the same. It poses a problem in the classroom for students to say, hey, I don't quite believe what this textbook says, because I see Korea as a much more dynamic place and not a victimized place. I see Korea as a more powerful place. And Korean history today, we're seeing these powerful things in their history. For example, some of the best warfare, some of the best artillery was developed by the Koreans in the war against the Japanese, and we haven't heard about that much before. So the more we learn about Korean history, the more it fits the time and explains how Korea could be such a powerful and dynamic country, whereas Korea years ago was a poor, picked on, victimized country.
I guess I do have another question. Do you encourage students to do their own historical research? Is that something you're like promoting through your work? And how do you think these students will have access to, I guess, a different perspective on Korean history?
Yes, I encourage students to re-examine what I teach in the classroom. If they don't buy it, if they see it differently, write it up in your paper and convince me. And I'll give a student a good grade if they completely contradict me, but they've got a good argument that makes sense. That's the college level kind of teaching. In high school, it's more a matter of learning facts, and so that's a little bit different. But I would hope that in high school as well, a student could look at the different facts and say, well, you know, Korea has had a lot of turmoil, but they have tremendous stability. These long dynasties, smooth transitions between dynasties. You know, the border between countries that has lasted the longest in the history of the world is the Yalu River, the Amnokang River between Korea on the south and Manchuria and China on the north. The fact of Koreans having so many people named Kim and Lee and Pak is an indication of peaceful stability. That's another thing a student could write about, because Korean names are really unique. Your name is unusual. It's one of the less frequently heard names. But Kim, Lee, and Pak are 45% of the population. And the question is why? And the answer is the stable history of Korea, because Korea did not kill off their kings and their aristocrats from previous dynasties the way other countries did. So there are lots of indicators of peace and stability. So a classroom student could take that argument, or they could argue against me and say, oh, Korea's had all these wars, and they could continue the normal argument. The normal argument about Korea is that there have been so many wars and chaos and turmoil. And I'm arguing for a different point of view. And the classroom student has to make his choice. He can use it and make a debate out of it, indeed. So that's my way of looking at it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel, for coming in. Appreciate your questions. We'll see you next time.